On the last Saturday of August 1987, the Clayton County Fair was having its best year in a decade. The grandstands were packed for the tractor pull. Over 2,000 people, families with kids on their shoulders, teenagers eating corn dogs, old farmers in seed caps, analyzing every machine that rolled onto the track. The tractor pull was the main event. It always had been, going back to the 1940s when farmers would hitch their work machines to weighted sleds and see who could pull the farthest. Back then it had been a test of skill as much as horsepower, knowing when to shift, how to manage traction, when to back off before you burned the clutch. Those days were gone. By 1987, the tractor pull had become something different, something that made a lot of the old-timers shake their heads. Rick Holloway was the reason. Let me tell you about Rick Holloway, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what happened that day. Rick was 45 years old and had owned Holloway Farm Equipment, the John Deere dealership in Elkader, for 15 years. He'd inherited it from his father, who'd built the business from nothing in the 90s. But where his father had been a mechanic who knew every bolt in every tractor, Rick was a salesman who knew every financing trick in the book. Rick was good at selling tractors, very good. He had a gift for making farmers feel like they needed equipment they couldn't afford, for convincing them that last year's model was obsolete, that new technology would pay for itself, that debt was just another word for investment. He was also, in the way of men who've never worked with their hands, contemptuous of anyone who didn't embrace the newest and the best. Old equipment wasn't just outdated to Rick, it was embarrassing, a sign of failure, a confession that you couldn't afford to keep up. The tractor pull had become Rick's annual showcase. For 3 years running, he'd brought the dealership's demonstration tractor to the competition. Not to test it, not to sell it, just to win. Just to stand in front of the whole county and prove that his machines were the best, that anyone still running old equipment was living in the past. In 1984, he'd brought a John Deere 4440 and won by 15 feet. In 1985, a 4640, won by 20 feet. In 1986, a 4840, won by the length of the track. Nobody could beat him. The local farmers brought their working tractors, machines they'd paid off over years, machines they maintained themselves, machines that were 10 or 15 or 20 years old. Rick brought whatever was newest on his lot, fresh from the factory, with every option ticked. It wasn't really a competition anymore. It was a demonstration of who had money and who didn't. But 1987 was going to be different. Rick had something special planned. Let me tell you about the John Deere 4850, because it was the most advanced farm tractor anyone in Clayton County had ever seen. The 4850 was John Deere's flagship model, a 200-horsepower monster with more electronics than most farmers' houses. It had computerized fuel injection that optimized the diesel mixture for every condition. It had digital readouts for engine temperature, hydraulic pressure, ground speed, fuel consumption. It had an automatic load sensing system that adjusted power delivery based on what the wheels were doing. And it had something new for 1987, a traction management computer. If the wheels started to slip, the computer would automatically reduce power to prevent damage. If the engine got too hot, it would dial back performance. If any sensor detected a problem, the whole system would go into protection mode. The engineers in Waterloo called it progress. The salesmen called it foolproof. Rick Holloway called it his ticket to permanent dominance. He'd ordered the 4850 in March, specifically for the August fair. $82,000, more than most of the farms in the county were worth. He didn't plan to sell it afterward. He planned to use it for demonstrations, for shows, for proving again and again that Holloway Farm Equipment had the best machines money could buy. On the morning of the fair, Rick rolled the 4850 off its trailer and drove it slowly through the midway, past the funnel cake stands and the livestock barns and the craft exhibits. He wanted everyone to see it. He wanted everyone to know what was coming. The tractor gleamed in the summer sun, green and yellow paint so bright it hurt to look at. The cab was climate-controlled. The seat was air-cushioned. The steering wheel had a leather wrap. It looked like it had rolled out of a showroom. because it had. By 3 o'clock that afternoon, the grandstands were full, and the tractor pull was underway. The smaller classes went first. Garden tractors, utility machines, antiques competing against each other. Rick watched from the side, arms crossed, waiting for his moment. The main event started at 5 o'clock. The heavyweight class, open to any farm tractor over 150 horsepower. 6 local farmers had entered. Their machines were the workhorses of their operations. John Deere 4430s and 4440s, International Harvesters, a Massey Ferguson, all of them well used, all of them showing their years. Good machines, honest machines. Rick watched them pull one by one. The best of them, Dale Henderson with his 1979 4440, made it 287 feet before the sled stopped him. A respectable pull. The crowd cheered. Then Rick climbed into the 4850. The crowd went quiet. They knew what was coming. They'd seen it before. Rick drove the 4850 to the starting line. Feeling the power humming through the seat, the diesel engine purring with controlled fury. The sled operator hooked the chain. The flag dropped. The 4850 lunged forward. 300 feet, 320. The sled was getting heavier with every foot. That was how the machine worked, transferring weight forward as the tractor pulled, making the load harder and harder. But the 4850 kept going. 360, 380, 400 feet. The sled stopped moving. The 4850's wheels spun, throwing dirt, but the weight had finally exceeded the tractor's ability to pull it. Rick had gone 406 feet, the longest pull in Clayton County Fair history. The crowd applauded politely. Rick climbed down from the cab and walked to the announcer's platform. "Ladies and gentlemen, I think we have a new champion." The announcer's voice echoed across the fairground. 406 feet for Rick Holloway and the new John Deere 4850. Is there anyone who thinks they can beat that? Rick took the microphone. He did this every year. The victory speech, the challenge, the showmanship. 406 feet, Rick said, grinning at the crowd. That's technology, folks. That's what happens when you invest in the best equipment. Now, I know some of you are out there running antiques, running machines your grandfathers bought. And that's fine for a museum. But this is a competition. This is the modern age. Does anyone out there really think they can match what this machine just did? He paused, letting the question hang. The crowd murmured. Nobody moved. That's what I thought, Rick said. See you all next year. Maybe by then some of you will have upgraded to real tractors. The crowd shifted uncomfortably. The old-timers were shaking their heads. The farmers who'd competed looked at the ground. And then a pickup truck pulled into the fairground. Now let me tell you about Howard Pickens, because he's the reason this story is still being told. Howard Pickens was 63 years old and had farmed 280 acres in the northeast corner of Clayton County for 40 years. He'd taken over the farm from his father in 1947, at the age of 23, and he'd been working the same ground ever since. Howard was not a man who talked much. He went to church on Sundays, nodded to his neighbors at the feed store, paid his bills on time, and kept to himself. He'd been widowed in 1975 when his wife Martha passed from cancer, and since then he'd lived alone in the farmhouse where he'd raised 2 sons. Both of them moved away now, one to Minneapolis, one to California. If you asked people in Clayton County about Howard Pickens, they'd tell you he was quiet, reliable, and old-fashioned. He didn't owe money to anyone. He didn't buy new equipment unless his old equipment couldn't be repaired. He drove a 1972 Ford pickup that he'd maintained himself for 15 years. And in his barn, under a canvas tarp that hadn't been lifted in a decade, sat a 1950 Oliver 88. Let me tell you about that tractor because it's the heart of this story. The Oliver 88 was a row crop tractor built in the late 1940s and early 1950s, designed for the kind of all-around farm work that smaller operations needed. It wasn't the biggest machine Oliver made, and it wasn't the most powerful, but it was solid, reliable, and built to last. Howard's father, Earl Pickens, had bought this particular Oliver 88 new in 1950, He'd walked into the implement dealer in Elkader, the same building that was now Rick Holloway's John Deere dealership, and paid cash for it. $2,800, everything he'd saved from 4 years of good crops. "This tractor will outlast both of us," Earl had told his son. "You take care of it, and it'll take care of you." Earl had used that Oliver to farm until 1970, when his health failed and Howard took over the operation full-time. By then the Oliver was 20 years old, ancient by modern standards, but it ran as smoothly as it had the day Earl brought it home. Howard had retired the Oliver in 1978, when he finally broke down and bought a used John Deere 4020 to handle the heavier work, but he couldn't bring himself to sell his father's tractor. He'd parked it in the back of the barn, covered it with a tarp, and left it there. He hadn't started it in 9 years, but he'd never forgotten what it could do. Now let me pause here and ask you something. Have you ever kept something that everyone told you was useless? Something that didn't make sense to keep, that cost you space and time and maybe a little pride, but you kept it anyway, because it meant something that couldn't be measured in dollars? Howard Pickens had kept his father's tractor for 37 years. He'd kept it through hard times and good times, through droughts and floods, through the deaths of his parents and his wife, and the departure of his children. He'd kept it when people told him it was just taking up space, when dealers offered him a few $100s to haul it away, when his sons suggested he sell it and buy something useful. He'd kept it because his father had said it would outlast both of them, and because he'd always known, somewhere deep down, that someday it would matter. Let me tell you about what happened when Howard's pickup pulled into the fairground. The truck came down the gravel road slowly, towing a flatbed trailer. On the trailer, strapped down with chains, was something that made the crowd turn and stare. A tractor, but not like any tractor that had been at the fair that day. This machine was old, visibly, unmistakably old. The paint was faded green, worn down to bare metal in places. The exhaust pipe was attached with baling wire. The tires were cracked with age, but still holding air. A thin wisp of smoke rose from the stack. Howard had started it that morning for the first time in 9 years, and the engine was still burning off old oil. "What the hell is that?" someone in the crowd said. "That's an Oliver," an old-timer answered. "An '88. Haven't seen one of those in 20 years. Howard backed the trailer to the edge of the track and began unhooking the chains. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't acknowledge the murmurs. He just worked, the way he always worked. Steady, methodical, unhurried. Rick Holloway saw what was happening and started laughing. "Someone call the museum," he said into the microphone, loud enough for the whole grandstand to hear. "They're missing an exhibit." The crowd laughed, nervously, unsurely. "Hey, old-timer," Rick called out, walking toward Howard. "You know this is a tractor pull, right? Not a parade of relics. That thing looks like it belongs in a junkyard." Howard didn't respond. He finished unchaining the Oliver, climbed up onto the seat, and started the engine. It caught with a cough and a rattle, then settled into a steady rumble, not smooth like the 4850, but alive, real. "You can't be serious," Rick said, still laughing but less certain now. "You want to enter that? Against my 4850? Howard looked at Rick for the first time. His eyes were calm, his face expressionless. "I want to pull," he said. "That's what this competition is for. That thing's not going to make it 10 feet. You'll embarrass yourself in front of the whole county. Then it won't take long." The crowd had gone quiet. The announcer looked from Rick to Howard, uncertain what to do. "Rules say any tractor over 50 horsepower can enter the heavyweight class," Howard said. "This Oliver's rated at 55. I paid my entry fee. I'm entitled to pull." Rick's face darkened. "This is ridiculous. The competition's over. I already won." "Competition's not over till everyone who wants to pull has pulled." The announcer cleared his throat. "He's technically correct, Mr. Holloway. The rules do allow any tractor that meets the horsepower requirement, and the entry fee was paid." Rick looked at the crowd, at the old men nodding, at the younger farmers watching with sudden interest. He could feel the momentum shifting, feel people starting to root for the underdog, the way crowds always did when the stakes were clear. He made a decision. "Fine," Rick said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Let the old man embarrass himself. After he stalls out at the starting line, maybe someone will give him a ride home." He walked back to the announcer's platform, arms crossed, smiling the smile of a man who knows he's already won. Howard Pickens drove the Oliver 88 to the starting line. Let me tell you about the first pull, because that's when everything started to change. The sled operator looked at the Oliver skeptically, then shrugged and hooked the chain. The crowd leaned forward, 2,000 people, watching a 37-year-old tractor try to compete with the most advanced farm machine money could buy. The flag dropped. Howard pushed the throttle forward. Forward. The Oliver's engine roared. A different sound than the 4850's diesel purr. Rougher, raw, more like a living thing than a machine. Black smoke belched from the exhaust. The rear wheels dug into the dirt. The sled moved. 10 feet, 20 feet, 30 feet. The crowd started murmuring. "He's actually pulling it," someone said. 50 feet, 70 feet. The Oliver was shaking now, the whole frame vibrating with effort, but it kept going. 100 feet, 150. The sled was getting heavier, the weight transferring forward, but Howard didn't back off. He kept the throttle steady, kept the wheels turning, kept the old machine working. 200 feet, 250. The crowd was cheering now, not politely, but with real excitement, the kind of cheering that happens when people see something they didn't expect. 300 feet, 320, 340, 340. The Oliver's wheels started to spin. The engine screamed. Black smoke poured from the exhaust. 360 feet. The tractor stopped. The sled had beaten it. But 360 feet was only 46 feet behind Rick Holloway's championship pull. The crowd erupted. Howard shut down the engine and climbed off the tractor. His face was still calm, but there was something in his eyes, a quiet satisfaction. Rick Holloway's smile had disappeared. Now let me tell you about what happened next, because this is where the story becomes legend. The rules of the Clayton County Fair tractor pull allowed for 2 attempts. Every competitor got 2 chances at the sled, and the best pull counted as their final score. Howard had pulled 360 on his first attempt. To beat Rick's 406, he'd need to find 47 more feet somewhere. But as Howard examined the track, he noticed something. The first 200 feet were hard-packed dirt, firm, good traction. But after that, the track got softer, muddier. The afternoon sun had baked the surface, but underneath the soil was still wet from the morning dew. The electronic tractors, the 4850 and its competitors, had all struggled at the same point. Around 300 feet, their tires started to spin, and their computers started to intervene. Howard thought about his father, about what Earl Pickens would have said. "Computers are for bankers," Earl used to say. "Tractors are for farmers. The difference is bankers want to protect their investment. Farmers want to get the job done." Howard walked back to the Oliver. He checked the tire pressure, let out a few pounds to increase the contact patch. He examined the drawbar, made sure the chain angle was right. He did the things his father had taught him, the small adjustments that didn't show up in owner's manuals or dealer brochures. Then he looked at Rick Holloway. "Your turn first," Howard said. "Champion pulls last. That's tradition." Rick's jaw tightened. He didn't want to pull again. He'd already won, hadn't he? But the crowd was watching, and the announcer was looking at him expectantly, and there was no way to back out without looking afraid. "Fine," Rick said. "I'll show you what a real tractor can do." He climbed into the 4850, started the engine, and drove to the starting line. Let me tell you about Rick Holloway's second pull, because that's when the $80,000 computer made a decision for him. The flag dropped. The 4850 lunged forward, just like before. 100 feet, 200 feet. The crowd watched as Rick's tractor chewed through the track, throwing dirt behind it. 300 feet. The sled was heavy now, really heavy. The 4850's wheels started to slip. And here's where the technology failed. The mud was worse on the second pull, torn up by all the tractors that had come before, mixed with dew and oil and the churning of rubber. The 4850's traction sensors detected the slip and did exactly what they were designed to do. They reduced power to prevent wheel damage. Rick felt the engine back off. He pushed the throttle harder, but the computer overrode him. 320 feet. The tractor was bogging down. "Come on," Rick shouted, stomping on the pedal. But the sensors kept sensing, the computer kept computing, and the power kept dropping. 340 feet. The wheels were spinning freely now, throwing mud everywhere. The temperature gauge was climbing. The computer detected the heat and cut power further. 350 feet. The 4850 stopped. Rick slammed the steering wheel with his palm. He'd gone 56 feet less than his first pull. The computer had protected the tractor from damage, just like the engineers designed it to do. But it had cost him the competition. The crowd was silent. Rick climbed down from the cab, his face red with anger and humiliation. He didn't look at the grandstands. He didn't look at the announcer. He just walked back to the edge of the track and stood there, arms crossed, watching. Howard Pickens climbed onto the Oliver 88 for his second pull. Let me tell you about what happened in the next 3 minutes, because it's still the most talked about moment in Clayton County history. Howard started the engine. The Oliver coughed, rattled, then settled into its familiar rumble. He drove to the starting line, the old machine creaking and groaning but moving steady. The sled operator hooked the chain. The crowd was dead silent. The flag dropped. Howard pushed the throttle all the way forward. There were no sensors to override him, no computers to decide what was safe, no electronics to protect the machine from its own power. There was just an engine, a transmission, and a man who knew exactly what his tractor could do. The Oliver roared. 100 feet. The old tires dug into the hard-packed dirt, throwing clods behind them. 200 feet. The crowd was on its feet now, cheering, screaming. 300 feet. The mud started, the same mud that had killed the 4850's sensors, but the Oliver had no sensors. The wheels spun. Mud flew everywhere. The engine screamed at a pitch that should have been impossible for a 37-year-old machine. Howard didn't back off. He kept the throttle down, kept the power flowing, kept demanding everything the Oliver had to give. 320, 340, 360, matching his first pull. 370. The crowd was deafening now. People were jumping, hugging, screaming things that couldn't be heard over the roar of the engine. 380. 390. The sled was barely moving. The Oliver was barely moving. The whole competition came down to inches. 400 feet. The Oliver's engine made a sound, a deep mechanical groan, and for a moment, Howard thought it was over. But his father's voice was in his head. "This tractor will outlast both of us." He kept the throttle down. 401. 402, 403. The sled stopped. The Oliver's wheels spun freely. The pull was over. 403 feet. 3 feet short of Rick Holloway's record. But the crowd didn't care about 3 feet. The crowd erupted like nothing Howard had ever heard. 2,000 people screaming for a 63-year-old man on a 37-year-old tractor who'd come within spitting distance of the most advanced machine in the county. Howard shut down the engine. In the sudden silence, he could hear individual voices, people cheering his name, people laughing, people crying. He climbed down from the Oliver on shaking legs, and then he heard something else, a sound from the track, a familiar sound. Rick Holloway's 4850 was stuck. Now let me tell you about the mud pit, because that's where this story becomes something more than a competition. During Rick's second pull, the 4850 had churned the soft section of the track into something like quicksand. The heavy tractor, with its wide tires and massive weight, had dug ruts 18 inches deep. When Rick tried to drive off the track after the pull, the 4850 had settled into those ruts and stopped moving. The wheels spun. The computer sensed the slip and cut power. Rick tried again. More wheel spin, more power cut. The traction management system was doing exactly what it was designed to do, protecting the tractor from damage by preventing the wheels from spinning. But in doing so, it made escape impossible. The $80,000 John Deere 4850, the most advanced farm tractor money could buy, was stuck in the mud like a city car in a snowdrift. Rick climbed down and looked at the situation. His face was pale. The whole county was watching. His championship tractor, his pride and joy, his proof of technological superiority, was sitting helpless in a hole it had dug for itself. "Get a tow," he shouted. "Someone bring a truck." The fair officials looked around. There was no tow truck heavy enough to pull an 8-ton tractor out of mud that deep. "What about one of the other tractors?" someone suggested. But the other competitors had already loaded their machines. They'd need an hour to get back, and by then the mud would be even worse. Howard Pickens stood at the edge of the track, looking at the stuck 4850. Then he looked at his Oliver. "I could pull it out," he said. The words were quiet, but somehow everyone heard them. The crowd went silent. Rick Holloway's face went through several expressions: confusion, then anger, then something that might have been fear. "You can't be serious. That antique couldn't pull a shopping cart. It just pulled 403 feet of sled. I think it can manage a stuck tractor. The ground is unstable. You'll just get stuck too." "I know this machine," Howard said. "My father knew it before me. I've pulled stumps with it, pulled trucks out of ditches, pulled combines through spring mud. I know what it can do." He walked to the Oliver, climbed up onto the seat, and started the engine. The crowd watched in absolute silence. Howard drove the Oliver onto the track, carefully avoiding the worst of the ruts. He positioned the machine behind the stuck 4850 and backed up until the drawbars were aligned. "Hook the chain," he said. A fair official scrambled to connect the two tractors, the 37-year-old Oliver to the brand-new 4850. "Ready?" Howard asked. Rick Holloway said nothing. He stood at the edge of the track, arms at his sides, watching as his championship tractor was about to be rescued by the antique he'd mocked. Howard engaged the clutch. The Oliver's engine roared. The old tires dug into the mud, found purchase on the firmer soil beneath. The chain went taut. For a moment, nothing happened. The 4850 was heavy, 8 tons of metal and computer chips, sunk deep in the mud it had created. Then, slowly, the Oliver started to move forward, inch by inch, foot by foot. The Oliver pulled. The 4850 resisted. The mud sucked and grabbed and fought. But the Oliver had no sensors telling it to stop. No computer telling it the load was too heavy. No traction management system cutting power to protect the investment. It just pulled. The 4850 lurched. Then it moved. Then it rolled forward, out of the rut, onto firmer ground. Free. The crowd exploded. People were screaming, crying, hugging strangers. Old farmers who remembered when every tractor was mechanical, when every pull was about skill and nerve and knowing your machine, they were weeping openly. Howard Pickens unhooked the chain, drove the Oliver off the track, and shut down the engine. He didn't say a word. He didn't need to. Let me tell you about what happened after, because the story doesn't end in the mud. The official results listed Rick Holloway as the winner of the 1987 Clayton County Fair tractor pull. 406 feet beat 403 feet by the rules. But nobody in Clayton County remembered it that way. What they remembered was a 63-year-old man on a 37-year-old tractor, pulling within 3 feet of the most expensive machine anyone had ever seen, and then pulling that machine out of the mud when all its computers couldn't save it. The Fair Board held an emergency meeting that night and created a new category, the Heritage Class, for tractors more than 30 years old. Howard Pickens was named the inaugural champion, and the trophy they gave him, a brass plaque mounted on a piece of oak, has been in the Pickens family ever since. Rick Holloway left Clayton County the following spring. He sold the dealership to a competitor from Waterloo, reportedly at a significant loss. People said he couldn't stand the jokes anymore, couldn't stand walking into the feed store and hearing someone mention that time the Oliver pulled him out. The John Deere 4850 was sold at auction. It brought $60,000, $20,000 less than Rick had paid. The buyer was from Minnesota, and he never entered it in another tractor pull. Let me tell you about the Oliver, because that machine has a story too. After the fair, Howard drove the Oliver home and parked it in the barn. But he didn't cover it with a tarp. He cleaned it instead, washed off the mud, checked the fluids, tightened everything that had come loose during the pull. He replaced the baling wire on the exhaust pipe with a proper clamp. The next spring, he started entering tractor shows. Not pulls, just shows, where people could look at old machines and talk to the men who kept them running. Howard would tell the story of the 1987 fair, and people would gather around and kids would sit on the Oliver's seat and pretend to drive. Howard Pickens died in 2001 at the age of 77. He'd farmed until the last year of his life, still using the John Deere 4020 for the heavy work but bringing out the Oliver every August for the county fair's heritage class. He won that class 14 times. Nobody ever beat him. At his funeral, the pallbearers drove tractors, 3 John Deeres and the Oliver, polished and running smoothly, carrying the casket from the church to the cemetery. Half the county turned out to watch. His son David, the one who'd moved to Minnesota, came home for the service and stayed. He took over the farm, learned to maintain the Oliver the way his father and grandfather had, and kept the tradition going. Let me tell you about one last thing, because it's the thing that matters most. In 2005, a museum in Des Moines approached David Pickens about buying the Oliver 88. They offered $50,000 more than the tractor had ever been worth, more than Howard had paid for his entire farm back in 19... David turned them down. "My grandfather bought this tractor in 1950, he told them. He told my father it would outlast both of them. He was right. It outlasted him. It outlasted my father. And if I take care of it, it'll outlast me too. But it's just a machine," the museum representative said. "It belongs in a place where people can appreciate its historical significance." David smiled. "It's not just a machine, it's a lesson. It's proof that sometimes the old ways are better than all the computers in the world. That sometimes the things our fathers and grandfathers built are worth more than the things we can buy." He paused, looking at the Oliver where it sat in the barn, the same barn it had occupied for 55 years. "My father pulled a stuck tractor out of the mud with this machine in an $80,000 tractor, with every sensor and computer available. And this Oliver, this 37-year-old, 55 horsepower, no electronics, no computers, just metal and diesel Oliver, pulled it out like it was nothing. That's a nice story. It's not a story. It's a fact. And every year when I start this engine up and drive it to the county fair, people remember. They remember that the newest and the fanciest doesn't always mean the best. They remember that there's value in keeping old things running, in learning from our fathers and grandfathers, in not throwing away everything that came before just because something shinier comes along." The museum representative left without the tractor. The Oliver 88 is still in the Pickens family barn, still running, still entering the heritage class at the Clayton County Fair every August, and somewhere in storage, there's a brass plaque that Howard Pickens received in 19... It's mounted on a piece of oak, and the inscription reads, "Clayton County Fair, Heritage Class Champion, 9... Howard Pickens and his Oliver 88. Proof that the old ways still work." That's the story of the tractor pull. The story of a man who kept his father's machine for 37 years, not because it was valuable, not because it was useful, but because some things are worth keeping even when the world tells you to move on. Rick Holloway had $80,000 and the most advanced technology money could buy. Howard Pickens had his father's tractor and the knowledge of how to use it. When the mud came, the computer gave up. The Oliver kept pulling. That's the difference between a machine that protects itself and a machine that does the job. That's the difference between technology and tradition. That's why, 35 years later, people in Clayton County still tell this story. And the Oliver still runs,